So a little background on energy markets, because it was the motivation for this talk and for this work. And so basically, as we speak, there's an electricity market in most of the United States, and how that operates is that there's an independent system operator who makes a prediction of the demand for the near future and also some uncertainties in the system. This could be possibly wind. If you're familiar with control systems, basically, you see you're familiar with these block diagrams, and there's a W as the exogenous input. Now this W coincides with wind. And so, and then the outcome of this, the ISO, the independent system operator's actions, is the supply schedule, which generator should produce how much energy, and something called locational marginal prices, the price associated with per unit of energy at different nodes in the electricity network. Okay, so these are called locational marginal prices. They're marginal price because they represent the marginal cost of supplying electricity at a particular node. They're called locational because they're different from location to location. Okay, and so that's what the ISO does. So if you want to get a feel for this, basically this is the map of locational marginal prices in the PJM MISO system operator, who basically operates all these parts of the United States. And these are the heat map for the prices at this particular time and hour of the day.
PJM, that's cool.
Right. MISO. PJM and MISO, yeah. Both, yeah. And then so basically the more red areas mean the prices are higher, and the more blue and purple mean the prices are lower. So in particular, in all this area of the country at this particular time of day, the prices have been very negative, and the prices do become negative. And then right here, the prices are very high. Okay. And then so like this evolves every 5 minutes. So the next 5 minutes, the map looks like this. And then 5 minutes later, it looks like this. So you see oscillations both across time and space in these. And then 5 minutes later and 5 minutes later, eventually it settles down and it's all nice and blue. Yeah. I wish this was the US electoral map, but unfortunately, it's just a price heat map. But
who's winning?
Yeah, okay. So these price oscillations do get more dramatic. So for instance, this is for, again, a particular winter of 2011. The prices in Texas hit a couple thousand, over a period of a couple of hours, and also wild fluctuations and oscillations. Okay, so these price volatilities do get very dramatic. And so there's previous work on explaining this stuff, and in particular, Sean and his co-author Inku Chu basically had this very interesting work that has become a reference already after a short time, efficiency and marginal cost pricing. And Sean and Inku asked, can a competitive market with a small friction generate a volatile price outcome? Okay. So, and then basically their finding was that yes, so the fact that we see these volatilities doesn't mean that the market is inefficient. And, this dynamic equilibria can by nature be volatile. And are these wild fluctuations harmful? So the answer was that basically they skew the distribution of gains in this efficient equilibrium to the favor of the suppliers. Okay. And there are more results in there, but I guess Sean can advertise for himself if I'm missing something. If I'm misrepresenting something. Okay. So, and then there was some of our own previous work that really dealt with the issue of feedback in electricity markets. And so basically the previous block that I showed you had, you can see that this is essentially an open loop system, right? Demand and possibly wind come as exogenous inputs to this market, and the supply and occasional marginal prices come as output. So there's no feedback loop per se here. So there's been a lot of suggestions that basically by closing this loop, so that by allowing the consumers to respond to these occasional marginal prices, We'll get a more efficient system. We'll be mitigating the demand spikes. We'll be mitigating the price spikes, and we'll gain a lot of benefits. And so that may or may not be true, but basically some of our previous work has shown that this will depend a lot on how well the system operator is able to predict how consumers respond to prices and how sensitive the consumers are to these prices. So basically the message over there was that, so if you look at this, this is essentially a measure of volatility of supply. So it's a log scale volatility of supply. So this whole block inside these parentheses, it's simply supply, and this is supply at the next time in response to prices. This is price at some time, this is the supply function, and this is the log scale incremental over the supply, and this whole thing is averaging it over time. And the result said that basically this is upper bounded by some constant over this quantity, 1 minus theta star, which this theta star is the relative elasticity of consumers to producers. So as this relative elasticity increases of consumers to producers, then basically the upper bound on volatility increases, and then simulations show that this is a good approximation. Although it's an upper bound, actually volatility does increase. So yeah, so this theta star is the inverse of theta star. This is like coefficient of risk aversion. It's another metric of elasticity. It's essentially another elasticity. It's a coefficient of risk aversion. And by going to theta star, we get volatility of prices rather than demand, rather than supply.
What is C? C is the cost.
C here is just some constant. C dot inverse C, yeah, the small c is the cost function, and C dot is the derivative of the cost, and C dot inverse is the supply function.
Inverse of marginal cost.
Inverse of marginal cost, yeah. Yeah. Good. Yes.
You are telling that this is wholesale electricity market. So how consumers will respond to wholesale price, because they don't get that.
Right now they don't, but there's proposal for the future for them to be able to respond to the prices. So, and then just to get a feel for it, so what this does is that basically you could have an open loop system in which demand looks like this black curve, which has a relatively high variance if you look at the sample variance, because it deviates a lot from the mean. And by basically closing the loop in this way, you could be reducing it to this red curve, which has smaller peaks and valleys, but it's also a lot more jittery. So you could basically increasing the volatility. Okay. So this signal has smaller variance, so you've reduced the variance, the red one, but it's also more volatile, if you will, according to that metric. So then basically going back to this work that led to these results. So what we wanted to do was basically to go into more detailed models and examine what happens in the case of basically real-time pricing. And so for doing that, basically we wanted more detailed models and idealized assumptions, in the sense that we wanted to take this prediction step out of the way to see in perfect prediction what is the natural dynamics of the system. Okay, so there will be, so there are a lot of ideal assumptions here, but the reason for them is to examine the dynamics of the system under perfect information, completely rational consumers, and no prediction errors. So, so that's what we want to do. And for doing that, now basically we bring in a dynamic consumer model. And where does the dynamic in the consumption come from? The dynamic comes from basically, let's say, storage and shiftable loads. So shiftable loads are loads that consumers, big or small, are willing to postpone to a future time, possibly up to a deadline, in return for basically hoping to optimize, to minimize their total cost over a time horizon. And if they have access to storage, the same thing happens. So when the consumers are doing this load shifting, their state becomes the amount of shifted load, because that takes a dynamic evolution. And then when they are, in the case of a storage, the state becomes just the amount of stored energy. and these evolve dynamically in response to the exogenous events in the system. Okay? So what we'll do is we'll look at this particular setup. There is a monopolist provider that takes the role of the ISO. So why we call it the monopolist? Because it, basically this monopolist is essentially has a supply function, has a cost function called a supply cost function, and he provides as much energy as requested, and he sets the price to be the marginal cost of production. Okay, so that's what the monopolist does. And the price is marginal cost. Consumers respond to these prices and move on to the next step. So, the details will emerge as I proceed throughout the talk, but that's the idea. And this dynamic comes from load shifting in this talk. Okay, so this is basically our abstract model for a dynamic oligopolistic market. So, what is the exact definition or an approximate definition for the purpose of this talk? It's a market in which price per unit of the resource, okay, electricity in this case, is determined by instantaneous aggregate demand of finitely many agents. Because there are finitely many agents, they gain market power, essentially. And that refers to the word oligopolistic markets. So there are finitely many agents, they have market power, meaning that they impact the prices, and it's dynamic because these consumers have memory. Basically, what happened in the past affects their state. If the prices over the past few hours were high, I probably have a higher backlog demand now than if the prices over the past few hours were very low. Okay. So again, so we have a monopolistic resource provider, which essentially its role is a supply curve. Agents that enter and exit the market according to a random process. We assume that these agents are self-interested. They're only interested in minimizing their cost. They're fully rational, meaning that they don't make myopic decisions, and they also know about other agents in the market. Okay, so they know that, for instance, if we both at the same time request a huge amount of the resource, the price will spike, so they know that. And they make optimal decisions to minimize their total cost over their lifetime in the system. So they dynamically update their resource consumption decision in their lifetime, which is when they come, they have a deadline, and by that deadline, the job has to be finished, and they have to exit then. And then the constraint is that total resource consumption must be met before the deadline. So they can shift and move around their resource consumption, but by the deadline, this constraint has to be met. So towards the end of the talk, I'll come back at a relaxation of this constraint, that if the total consumption is not met exactly by the deadline, basically the trade-offs that we point out to still exist. So the tighter you make, if you allow some lost load not met by the deadline, it doesn't change the message of efficiency and risk trade-offs. Okay? So then we point out to efficiency and risk trade-offs under different market architectures. So what do I mean exactly by this is that, more precisely, we do a comparative study of the stationary aggregate demand process. So as a result of this process, basically there is some aggregate demand process that emerges from the dynamics of the system, and we look at the properties of this stationary aggregate demand. Okay? And what do I mean by market architecture? In this particular talk, we talk about whether the agents are cooperating or not cooperating with each other. Okay? So one architecture is that the agents, in minimizing their total cost, cooperate. So we all get together at time zero, sign a contract. We say we go to this market. Our goal is to minimize our aggregate cost. And the other case is that we do not cooperate. We compete. So it's kind of like a Nash equilibrium. If it was a static game, basically there would be a Nash equilibrium in which I know what you will request and you know what I will request, and basically we arrive at an equilibrium. But this is essentially the dynamic version of that. Okay? So that's the non-cooperative scenario. So basically another message here is that from the system operator's perspective, this aggregate behavior of agents is non-trivial. Basically, we are interested in why we look at the stationary aggregate demand process, because when we basically design a system like this, the effects that happen, the emerging aggregate behaviors are non-trivial, and we want to understand that. And the message is that these agent interactions can lead to endogenous risk, in the sense that although the agents are optimizing their own cost, this may lead to some undesired events in the system that we characterize more precisely as risk as we proceed, and that's what we call endogenous risk. So an exogenous risk would be a risk that, of a disaster for the system, an earthquake or something like that. An endogenous risk would be one that is created by the agents in the system. And the mechanisms essentially that channel exogenous shocks into endogenous risk in network systems are open questions. So that this work is an attempt to basically start or make progress in this area. So basically there has been previous work on the issue of endogenous risk. So endogenous risk, again, being risk that is created by the agents in the system. The sources of endogenous risk, for instance, has been studied under has been attributed to heterogeneous beliefs in this particular work, the leverage cycles. And so this is in the context of financial markets. So it's because, for instance, different agents have different beliefs about the state of the system, or the sufficient statistics of the system, or anything about the system. So that would be a heterogeneous belief case. This is not the case in our model. So our model is more idealized. And or failure of the agents to rationalize feedback links. So basically failure to realize that there's a feedback in the system. They're affecting the price or the resource demand. And the fact that risk sharing may lead to volatility, may lead to vulnerability. So by getting together and trying to mitigate risk, there has been previous work that has shown in the context of financial market again that risk sharing by itself may create new vulnerabilities. So this has appeared in particular in the asymmetric effects of diffusion processes. Okay. So, but in our work, agents are fully aware of the pricing mechanism. They know about other agents in the market, and they form rational expectations about what others will do. And we show that endogenous risk can arise from the nature of the system architecture and the fact that there is dynamics in the system, even at the rational expectation equilibrium. Okay? And we point to the trade-offs in this basically system. So what is well known is that basically externalities lead to efficiency loss. So there's a lot of work under this notion of price of anarchy, that basically in dynamic systems, when agents behave strategically, this is well known that it leads to efficiency loss. And basically, a lot of literature on price of anarchy addresses those issues. So what is less well known is that these externalities, or let's say strategic behaviors, may lead to a system that is more robust. Okay, so that's one message. When they do not cooperate, when the individuals do not cooperate, that system may be more robust. Okay, so essentially that agent cooperation can reduce externalities, lead to a more efficient system, but the system can become more vulnerable to some exogenous shocks. Okay.
What do you mean by the robustness in this case?
Right. So robustness in this case is 1 minus risk.
What does that mean?
It will become more clear. Okay, so it's more robust. So it means that, for instance, it has, in this particular context, it means it has lower probability of producing huge spikes in the demand. So in this particular context. So it's simply the inverse of risk. So let's read this. Less well known is that externalities may cause less risk. Okay.
That sounds like the reverse.
Well, partly, the cooperation, you can imagine causing trouble because then they become like monopoly. All the agents get
Right.
together, and then if they're all acting selfishly, then you can imagine more like the economic ideal, about price-taking behavior and all that.
Right, right.
And then it sounds like something economists would love to hear.
So what will happen is that I'll give intuition why this happens as I proceed and I introduce more details. Okay, so I'm introducing these basically as I proceed. I'll give more details. Okay. So this basically summarizes what I said so far, that we can have two market architectures. In one case, the consumers behave strategically. When they behave strategically, it happens that they're more conservative in responding to the exogenous events in the system. And that conservativeness in the responding to exogenous events in the system leads to also more, in a sense, they're more conservative in absorbing the exogenous uncertainties. So this leads to a less efficient system. So this is the price of anarchy, if you will. And our message is that it might be also lower risk for the system. And on the other hand, when the agents cooperate, they're more aggressive in responding to the exogenous events in the system, absorbing the exogenous uncertainties. They are more efficient if the efficiency metric is the welfare of the consumers and producers, or just even if it's just the welfare of the consumers. But it's also higher risk. Okay? So this was the price of anarchy. So maybe this is price of coordination, or to be more provocative, we could call it value of anarchy. Anyway, so that's the message. Okay.
But the efficiency is surprising too, though, because the consumers are monopolized. So I think a large number of strategic agents would look closer to the economic idea.
If we have a large number of strategic agents, we'll approach to this. We'll approach to the cooperative case. Okay, so in this setup at least, if we have a large number of strategic agents, it will automatically shift the behavior from this setup to this setup. It will shift to more high efficiency, high risk. Okay. So there are some other, basically other than power systems, there are some other areas that we have thought about that this model could be relevant. So in the interest of time, I'll skip this one because I want to spend more time on the coming slides. But so the context is not just limited to this area. So the model is relevant to inventory control, interbank lending, portfolio rebalancing, and load scheduling that I already talked about, all in an abstract sense. Okay. So far this was like a preview, and right now I'll get into the more specifics and details of the model. Okay. So I'll introduce the agent arrival process and timings of the events. So I already said that basically this is a model in which consumers arrive in the system, and when they arrive, they have a deadline by which they have to leave, and so then they exit the system, and by that time they must have met their resource consumption constraint. And the model for resource production and pricing, this is the monopolist's role that basically meets, supplies the requested demand and sets the price to the marginal cost of production. I'll introduce what kind of dynamics emerges from this kind of interaction. And I'll specifically introduce these cooperative and non-cooperative schemes for the agents to respond to the real-time market conditions. And introduce these welfare metrics that I've been talking about, efficiency and risk, in more detail and more precisely. I'll say what they are and show the trade-off. Okay. So we have different types of agents in this model: type 1, type 2, type 3, type L. And a type 1 agent is an agent when they arrive, they cannot shift their loads to the future. They must consume upon arrival. So this could also represent renewable generation, so as a negative of the load. Type 2 agents, when they arrive, they have 2 time slots to finish the to meet the resource consumption requirements. So if I don't meet all my resource consumption requirements now, I have the next period. Okay? And type 3 has 3 periods, more flexible, and so on. So for instance, in this animation, we have at time t, we have arrival of a type 1 agent and a type 2 agent. Type 2 is blue, type 1 is red. So type 1 has no decision to make, has to consume, and it does so. So the type 2 agent looks at the amount of load that is arrived here, and he knows that the type 1 agent will be consuming. So he knows that if he consumes as much, then their aggregate demand will be high. So he takes a chance or does some optimization to shift some of the load to future. Okay? And by this time, now he has this standing balance of load that he must consume now because he's at his deadline. Okay? So in another scenario, a type 1 agent arrives with a smaller load, okay? And type 2 agent arrives with a large load. Type 2 agent looks at type 1 agent and sees that the type 1 agent's load is small. So it's good for him to consume more now and shift less to future. So unlike this scenario, he's consuming more, shifting less. Okay? And so on. So this is essentially the idea, and we can now have more agents and so on. So if we look at this, we can represent this as this system in which demand is an exogenous input. These demands are the amount of loads that these agents bring with themselves. Okay? So the magnitude of the load for each type agent. So this is dt, is an exogenous input to the system. So this ht is a 0-1 vector. It's essentially saying that if the agent arrives or not. So these arrival of these agents in this model are Bernoulli arrivals. So at each time slot, they may or may not arrive. So this ht is exogenous input for arrivals. And the state of the system evolves according to this. So this x is the state of backlog demands of each agent. So the dimension of x is as many types as we have, as many different types. So if you have L type of agents, then the dimension of x is L. And it evolves according to these equations where R1, R2 are some matrices that basically are very sparse matrices. We don't need to worry about the details of what these matrices look like. So it's just that we can represent the update in this way. Okay? So it's essentially saying that the backlog evolves according to this equation. My backlog at the next time step is my backlog at current step minus the amount that I choose to consume. This U is the decision by the consumer, minus the amount that I choose to consume, plus the amount of arrival of new load. Okay? And this Z is essentially important. It's an existence state in the sense that it keeps track of who is in the system, what is their backlog, and how much time they have to their deadline. Okay? So what type agents exist and what is their backlog. So this Z is also 0, 1. So, and has dimension L times L minus 1 over 2, but that's a detail that we don't need to worry about. So let's say just this is the general dynamics of the system. I'll come back to this dynamics towards the end of the talk. For now, I want to focus on the case that there are only 2 types to understand this dynamics a little bit better. Okay? So this is the general case, can be represented in this way. For some matrices R1 and R2. And for the L equal to 2 case, we can look at what happens. So for the L equal to 2 case, we can basically represent the state of the system as the aggregate unshiftable load at each time. We have a Bernoulli arrival rate Q for each type of agent. Okay? And when they arrive with a workload of dt, and that has its own distribution. Okay? So all of these are random. And the instantaneous demand by each agent is this vector U of t, and the aggregate demand is capital U of t. Okay? So what happens is that at time t, a new arrival realizes. consumer observed the system state xt. Red has no decision to make because he has to consume. So, but blue decides based on the state of the system, which is the total unshiftable load, whether it's good to consume at this period or shift to the next period. Okay? And when there's a deadline, the consumers obviously leave the market, and the agents know about the pricing mechanism, and the pricing is ex post. So in the sense that after the total demand is realized and the total supply has been made to the system to meet the demand, the price is said to be the marginal cost of production. We'll assume in this talk that this marginal the cost function is quadratic. So the marginal cost is linear. So the price is simply the total aggregate demand. That comes from quadratic assumption of quadratic cost on the supply. Okay? So these agents arrive, they observe, they make a decision whether to shift or not, and the price per period is the aggregate demand under the assumption of quadratic cost. Okay, so then we can see that the state of the system for the L equal to 2 case, the aggregate unshiftable load, basically evolves according to this equations. And this is now actually not difficult to parse. It says the aggregate unshiftable load at this period is the total unshiftable load that arrives at the current period, because we know if it arrives now and it's unshiftable, we can't do anything about it, plus this quantity, which is the leftover from the previous time steps shiftable decision. So if at the previous time step, D2, which is type 2 agent, had an arrival equal to this quantity, D2 of t minus 1, and chose to consume only this much, then this becomes a leftover that is pushed to the next period, and it's not shiftable anymore. So it gets added to the aggregate unshiftable demand. Okay? So when we have this only two types of agents, there is only one decision maker at each time, and that's the type 2 agent, right? And it must split its total consumption into two parts, u of t for the current period and d2 minus u of t for the next period. And this decision is made based on observing the system state and his workload realization. Okay? So then we talked about efficiency and risk, and we basically, before we proceed, I would like to give precise definitions to these. So efficiency is the standard definition of efficiency in economics. Producer surplus plus consumer surplus. So in this particular case, with quadratic supply cost, the welfare of the producer is the amount that takes in as revenue minus its total cost, and the welfare of consumer is total payment by the consumers. The consumers must consume, and they don't derive any other utility. It's just the payment that must be minimized. So in this particular case, it takes this particular form, essentially minus 1/2 second moment of the aggregate demand. So the higher, essentially, if you will, the variance of the aggregate demand, the less efficient the system will be. The lower the variance of the aggregate demand, the more efficient the system will be. So this is our metric for efficiency. And the metric for risk is the probability of aggregate unshiftable load peaking. Okay? So this aggregate unshiftable load, xt, if it's at some point too large, then the consumers must demand xt. And this being too large for some m, for any m, it becomes our metric for risk. And robustness is 1 minus this. 1 minus this probability. Okay, so again, for the matter of being precise, I would like to introduce this definition of Markov perfect equilibrium. So it's, if you will, loosely speaking, is a dynamic version of the Nash equilibrium for in static games. So the reason I'm introducing this is that for the non-cooperative case, we are looking at Markov perfect equilibria in this dynamic games among non-cooperative consumers. So I guess that informal definition suffices for this talk, but if you will, it's precisely it's defined as a sub-game perfect equilibrium of the dynamic game where the player's strategies depend only on the current state. Okay. So with that, I present the solution for the non-cooperative case. This is again a solution for only two agents, type 1 and type 2. Assumptions are that it's full state and everything gives information. Everybody knows how the system evolves, knows the statistics of the arrivals, and so on. No coordination among strategic agents. And we focus on a steady state in symmetric equilibria. Symmetric equilibria mean all the agents adopt the same strategy. And we already talked about there's only one decision maker. It's the type 2 agents. And this means that different type 2 agents arriving at different times in the system, they all adopt the same strategy. That's what we mean by symmetric equilibria.
What about, I was going to say value function. What about the future expectation?
In this equation, you mean? Well, in this equation, each agent that is making a decision needs to worry only about two periods, because there are only two types of agents. And this, the type 1 doesn't make any decision. Type 2 only cares about the current period and the next period. Right? Yeah. Because by the end of the next period must exit the system. And as Sean already pointed out, so this is the optimal decision given by the non-cooperative agent must minimize the total current payment plus the expected payment at the next time step, right? And this expected payment at the next time step is by forming rational expectation over the next time step's price. And given that the demand for the next time step will be his workload realization that just arrived minus the amount that consumes now. Okay? So this is the total. This minimizes the expected cost of this type 2 agent upon arrival up to his lifetime, which is 2 periods. And so we know that price is, as we talked, because of the marginal cost pricing and quadratic cost, is aggregate demand, which is the aggregate unshiftable load at the current state plus the amount that type 2 agent demands. So it becomes xt plus ut. And the next price, which is here, is xt plus 1 plus the amount that this agent will demand in the next period. Okay? So
the randomness is only coming from the random arrival process?
The randomness is both in the random arrival process and in the workload that they bring with themselves. So D is random as well. Not D, so D2, once it arrives, it's...
Yeah, that's also determined by the arrival.
Once it arrives, there is also a distribution on D2.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in this basically symmetric Markov perfect equilibrium, in this dynamic stochastic game, we can show that there exists a unique symmetric Markov perfect equilibrium with linear strategy in this game. Okay? So these coefficients have some complicated dependencies on the parameters of the system. In this case, Q1, Q2, mu1, mu2. What are these? Arrival rate of type 1 agent, Bernoulli arrival rate of type 2 agent, and the mean of the workloads. So this is about the statistics of the randomness in D. Okay, so these have some complicated dependencies, but we don't care about this right now. Okay. So, so for the cooperative case, remember that basically the setup is that we get together, we decide that we're going to go to this market and we're going to minimize our costs. Right? So for the cooperative case, now we are looking at an average cost dynamic programming. Okay? And basically, without getting into the details of this, so this is essentially the Bellman equation for an infinite horizon average cost Markov decision process. Okay? So this is the non-cooperative scenario. And for the non-cooperative scenario as well, we can show that there is an optimal strategy which is linear. For the cooperative strategy. Right. For the cooperative strategies as well, we can show that this is, there exists a linear optimal strategy, and these also have dependencies on these parameters, but we basically we won't be bothering with those details. So what's interesting is that, so remember we were interested in efficiency and risk. So what's interesting is if we focus here, for the cooperative strategy, this AC happens to be a larger quantity in magnitude than A of S, which stands here for strategic non-cooperative behavior. And B is the reverse. So what this means intuitively is that when we cooperate, agents put a heavier weight on the aggregate backlog of the system. When we are cooperating, in my decisions, I put a heavier weight on everybody else's backlog. When we are not cooperating, I am less sensitive to aggregate backlog. I'm more sensitive to my own demand that currently arrived. Okay, so that's why B is larger for the non-cooperative case. So that's basically the only thing to look at here. And the fact that basically this risk, we can compute it analytically. So, okay, but we don't need to worry about these. So in this particular case, we can compute both efficiency and risk analytically. So now, when we simulate, very interesting things happen. So if you look at this plot on the left, this is the blue curve is for the non-cooperative scenario. Right, this is the aggregate demand. This is the aggregate demand, and this is time. So the blue curve is non-cooperative, and the red curve is cooperative. So we see that the red curve does a much better job in smoothing the demand, filling the valleys, shaving the peaks, and everything. But when you look at this over a longer time scale, you see that the red curve produces spikes. So this is the risk. Okay. So these spikes are what we quantified by risk, and that's it. So one intuition I can give for this is that when we cooperate, basically, I rely on you, you rely on me for meeting our demands. And as a result, I may be shifting more, hoping that in the future, you or any agent who arrives in the system will arrive and help me with basically meeting my demand. He will consume less, and I will consume more, and I will meet my demand. So when we cooperate, we rely more on each other, and eventually, on average, it works well. But eventually, it hits a point when everybody is at their deadline, and then we must all consume. But when we do not cooperate, I'm more conservative in shifting my load to the future. So I consume more now, and somehow the probability that we all arrive at this deadline where we all have to consume decreases. Okay. So here are again the same aggregate demand stationary distributions. Over log scale, it just shows that there is a heavier tail for the cooperative scheme. And there is the non-cooperative scheme has a smaller tail. So the probability of spikes is larger for this heavy tail, for these cooperative schemes. Okay? So, so this essentially summarizes, again, what we talked about already. The non-cooperative scheme is less efficient but has lower risk. The cooperative scheme is more efficient and has higher risk. Okay? So with that, so I'll skip this. What it's essentially saying is, maybe I have time for this. Okay. So then we could ask, what is in between these cooperative and non-cooperative scenarios? What can we introduce in between? So we changed the pricing scheme, okay, by introducing this parameter alpha. So this is like per se in a very basic mechanism design in which we penalize too much backlog by agents. Okay? So they pay a price not only for their demand but also for their backlog, so that we want to prevent this too much backlog, so that we would mitigate the risk in the system. Okay? So by introducing this alpha, by changing the pricing mechanism to penalize backlog, we obtain a situation which it can be verified that basically when this alpha is 0, we are back to the non-cooperative case, a strategic case. And when alpha equal to 1, we very well approximate, we are not identical, but approximate the cooperative scenario. And then we look at the linear strategies again. Okay? And what we observe is that this nice trade-off between efficiency and robustness. So when alpha is 0, we are at the strategic case. We are less efficient, but we are also more robust. So this is 1 minus the tail probability. And when alpha is 1, we approach the cooperative case. Efficiency increases, and robustness decreases. Okay? So just going over this very quickly. And so now if we have differently many agents arriving, then as the number of agents increases, so this result says that you approach the cooperative scheme. As market power decreases and you approach the cooperative scheme, as the types are still only type 1 and type 2, but the number of different agents that arrive at each period is k, and as k goes to infinity from 1 to infinity, then we approach the cooperative scenario. And so this also shows, again, for this case, the efficiency robustness trade-off. So as k increases, as the number of agents increases, then we have efficiency increases and robustness decreases. So this is this is a slide to show basically some intuition behind when do these spikes occur. Okay, and we look at, instead of just the distribution of the aggregate demand, we look at the conditional distribution of the aggregate demand, condition on arrival or not arrival of type 2 agent, and also condition on backlog state being high. So here we see that when we condition on the type 2 arrival agent, we get a system which has a smaller tail. When there is no arrival of type 2 agent, we get a distribution that is more spread. Same true here. When the backlog is high, then we get a basically heavier tail. So the combination of these two tell us that these spikes mostly occur when there is the backlog in the system is high, which makes sense, and there is no type 2 arrival of agent. Okay, so to take this part out of the way, we want to focus on when the backlog state is high so that we can say some things about the general L case. So everything I showed so far was for the case that L equal to 2. So we have results for L equal to 3. They look qualitatively exactly the same, so nothing changes. Beyond that, the complexity of this thing is too much, so we can't solve that. So therefore, we are going to do some approximations to be able to say if these trade-offs exist for the general case, that we have all these different types of agents. And for that, we have to modify the system a little bit. And the modification is that we will look at basically the variance of the backlog state and take that as a surrogate metric for risk. Okay. So so in this case, we are basically modifying the system, assuming that at each time there is an arrival of every type of agent. Okay, so we take the Bernoulli arrival out of the picture, and at each period we have arrivals. So the only thing that remains is their workload realization, the workload realization of consumers, and their decisions. And we look at 3 different metrics. So now our system evolves according to this. We don't have a Z state anymore because we set arrivals to be certain at each period. And we look at linear strategies adopted by agents. So we look at 3 outputs, which are the demand variance, backlog state variance. So this would be our surrogate metric for risk, and unsatisfied load. So this would be soft deadline constraints. So we are relaxing the deadline constraints, as I said earlier at the beginning of my talk. So this demand variance becomes a surrogate metric for efficiency. Backlog variance becomes a surrogate for risk. And unsatisfied load becomes a for relaxation of the deadline constraint. So now I allow for some unsatisfied load at the end of the deadline. Okay? So now we look at the three-way trade-offs between these constraints. Okay? And basically, this proposition is about a three-way trade-off between efficiency and risk. And it's essentially saying that when you look at the H2 gain of this system over these linear strategies, no matter which one you pick to optimize, the other two constraints are tight. Subject to constraints on the other two objectives, at optimum, the constraints will be tight. That's what the proposition is saying. So that creates an efficient frontier. Okay? So between these three objectives, efficiency, risk, and some unsatisfied load or deadline constraint, so this proposition says whichever one you try to optimize by designing the best controller, and that minimizes the H2 gain of the system, not the best controller, subject to some constraints on the controller, I'll explain. No matter which one you choose to optimize, subject to constraints on the other one, the constraints are tight. Therefore, basically, your objective function is strictly decreasing on these constraints. So what this translates into, it gives us some nice trade-offs. So for instance, under strict deadline constraints, which was the basically what we've been talking so far, what we get is that we get a two-way trade-off between the demand variance and backlog variance. So it's a two-way trade-off between efficiency and risk. So if you will, on these curves, this variance increases, risk increases. And here, this variance increases, efficiency decreases. Okay? So on this efficiency frontier, we see that basically as we relax under strict deadline constraints, we have two different basically strategies. One is that I'm putting a lot of weight on the other agents, backlog. This is what it means. And this means I put a lower weight on the other agent's backlog. So I pay more attention to myself. So this essentially means that this approximates more so the non-cooperative case, and this approximates the cooperative case. So in this approximation of the cooperative case, we see that we are more efficient, but we are also in a low efficiency, high risk case. When I pay less attention to the backlog of the other agents, this would be kind of like the non-cooperative case. We are in the low efficiency, low risk regime. Right? So that's what it is. Okay. Sean, are you okay with this? Yeah. So just to summarize again, so this one approximates the cooperative case, high efficiency, high risk. This one approximates the non-cooperative case, low efficiency, low risk. Okay. And so this one is about deadline constraints. So are we allowing some unsatisfied demand or not? So as we move from left to right, we are tightening the deadline constraint. So this one, the blue one, has loose deadline constraint. It allows for a lot of unsatisfied load at the end of the deadline. This one allows for some amount of unsatisfied load, and this is strictly enforcing more or less the deadline constraint. So not allowing for any unsatisfied load. So this is essentially equivalent to tightening this constraint on Y3, and we observe that as we tighten this constraint, demand variance increases and backlog increases. So it means that it pushes us to a low efficiency, high risk regime. And so something similar here, but I wanted to also show this. This one is about, if you will, about the architecture, about the weight that we put on backlog of other agents. Okay? So in the control design. So the weight the lower this delta, the lower weight on the backlog of other agents means it's less interaction between the agents. So it moves towards, if you will, the non-cooperative scenario, okay, with less interaction. So this shifts the efficiency frontier towards low efficiency, low-risk region. So with less interaction among these agents, we get, again, lower efficiency, lower risk. So this delta increases. This delta increase is shown in these figures by the transition from blue to red. Okay. And so this essentially shifts us to the less interaction, shifts us to the low efficiency, low risk regime. Okay. So I guess I'm also out of time. So the conclusion is that there are trade-offs in system design between various objectives. We studied more so the trade-offs between efficiency and robustness, but there are other aspects, for instance, complexity or architecture. So this basically some aspects of this complexity appears here in this interaction among agents. So the more interaction may require also more communication complexity as well to create a cooperative scheme. But with that, I guess I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay. Thank you.
You have considered shiftable loads, where loads can be shifted from one period to another.
Right.
So there is energy constraint. But what happens if it has some power constraint, like at a particular time it cannot consume more power? Then how your model will take care of that?
Yeah, so I don't believe that the message will change. So we have played with a lot of things with this model. We are unable to get analytical results because for this was already not easy, and for more than few agents we can't get analytical results anyway. But in simulations, when the trade-offs remain there, so the efficiency and risk trade-offs.
I think this question is regarding to the if you have a power and at this particular time slot you wanted to consume what you are allowed to consume, right?
Okay.
Rather than you kind of postpone it to the future. If you do have the residual power there.
So this would be the case that there are real-time prices, essentially. Yes, if I'm not exposed to the real-time market conditions, then yes, I'm allowed to. I have this demand for now, and I'm allowed to use it. I'll use it if I need to. But if price matters, if I'm exposed to the real-time market conditions, let's say you want to charge your electric vehicle. You have a deadline constraint. You want it to be charged by 6 p.m. and within this time frame, you don't care when it is charged. So you're willing to shift some of that load to future if the current demand is too high and the current price is too high.
But you already have some power is already delivered, right? If there's no point to shift some of the power.
No, I can make a decision at the beginning of the period how much I want to consume for the next period. So there's a decision to be made for, thinking of discrete times. Every discrete time, at the beginning, I decide how much I want to consume for the next period.
That's coming to my question. How long is this time period?
So in this model, the time periods that the agents make decisions is defined by their type. If it's a type 1 agent, it's 1 period, there's no decision to be made. If it's a type 2, so just 2 periods. So by the end of the next period, I'll have to be done.
But the only thing is that this is related to also the arrival process as well. If this time period is too long, then there's many kind of arrivals
right.
in between. You have to wait for the next
right. So at some
the schedule.
Right.
It's too small or too short.
It's a tractability issue.
Yeah.
It's a tractability issue.
Yeah.
So if your point is that L equal to 2 is too small.
No. What I'm saying, the time period, the time zone. I'm kind of thinking about the actual system. Because all the decision processes, you count the arrivals at the beginning of the slot, right?
Right.
So
this, as I said at the beginning, there are a lot of idealized assumptions here that basically we know at the beginning we can manage to make the decision for that whole time period. At the beginning of each period we look at the system, we look at the state, we look at all the other agents that are present in the system, we make that decision and we move on to the next step. So this is an idealized assumption And the purpose of this was to show that basically these risks can emerge under the most idealized assumptions. So we are not attributing it to asymmetry of information, irrational behavior, or anything like that. You're saying it's a natural dynamics of the system can arise from the system design and the architecture of the system.
Maybe one comment.
Sure.
Based on your work and my work,
Right.
the marginal cost of price, is a little bit.
Right, right.
Maybe,
That's
I
the.
don't make a comment about that in your paper, because I mean, there's no real reason. Well, in a competitive equilibrium setting, we wouldn't expect marginal cost based on my work. In a strategic setting, you wouldn't expect marginal cost based on your work.
Right.
And if it was really a monopolist, you can imagine the funky things they would do at prices to try to manipulate the system.
Right.
It's really one big monopolist who could do anything with prices.
Right, but it's my understanding that basically the monopolist, basically for any given price, what the monopolist will do is will supply as much as it's equal to its marginal cost. That would maximize even the monopolist utility.
Well, this dynamics, they know, I mean, if they really, you might want to manipulate it.
So the monopolists here are. I wonder if you were talking about the supplier or the consumer.
Both sides.
The both sides,
Both
right?
sides, I mean, if the consumers are cooperating, they become monopolists.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they can manipulate prices.
They anticipate their effect in this model. They do anticipate their effect on the price.
Yeah. And then the monopolist suppliers.
Right. They anticipate their effect on the price, but they're rational in the sense that they optimize. They just care about expected minimization. They don't manipulate, if you will. They just anticipate their effect on price.
Yeah.
Right.
But you think that manipulation, you think would be an outcome of they're trying to optimize.
Right.
That's what I wonder, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So in that sense, yes. So they anticipate their effect on the price,
Yeah.
and they make a decision based on that.
Anyway, there's a bunch of questions.
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
I'm interested in the variance of this spike. Like, do you have any measurements on how the variance of the arrival process versus the variance of these loads affect the variance of these spikes?
The variance of the spikes.
I mean, variability, like.
So what is here is that basically there for the case that I presented the complete solution, the L equal to 2 case, the variance of the demand decreases. Okay, that's why the system is more efficient. But the probability of the spikes increases for the cooperative case. Okay? And then the latter part of the presentation was about a general case. And in that general case, there is a three-way trade-off between the variance of demand, variance of backlog, which we take as a surrogate for the probability of spikes. Okay, so it's not exactly that, but it's a surrogate for probability of spikes. So variance of demand, variance of backlog, and how tight your deadline constraints are. So let's say the deadline constraints are tight. There's a trade-off between variance of demand and variance of backlog. And variance of backlog translates to probability of spikes as an approximation.
So I have a question about the results, your results about the trade-off between the efficiency and the robustness.
Okay.
Suppose if we don't consider the stochastic demand arrival,
Right.
then suppose we are given a total amount for demand over some time slots, because your cost function is a quadratic cost function.
Mm-hmm.
So to minimize the total cost, that means we should distribute the demand evenly across the all time slots.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so by these things, in this method, then the load variance should be minimized.
Right.
Then by minimizing the load variance, then the peak load should also be minimized.
Well,
So I don't know why there are the trade-off between.
no, not necessarily. So exactly what happens here. So first of all, there is a stochasticity here. Okay, so there is a stochastic arrivals. There is a stochasticity in the sense of the workload realization itself. And then what happens here is that the cooperative case, so efficiency in this model amounted to this quantity minus the second moment of demand, if you will. Okay, so yeah, so efficiency in this model, because of the assumption of quadratic cost, becomes minus the second moment of the aggregate demand. And when you want to increase efficiency, you are decreasing the variance. Okay, so that's exactly what the cooperative scheme does. So it decreases the variance of the aggregate demand, but that doesn't mean that the tail is also decreased. So it pushes it to a heavier tail regime. The variance is lower but has heavier tail.
Actually consistent with what you said earlier.
It's consistent with what you said, yeah.
Okay, well, if you have further questions, Marjdavij will be back here in December for the energy workshop.
Yes, sure. Looking forward to it, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.